are you doing? You having a good day today? Cool. All right. So I wanted to talk to you guys today a little bit about data visualization, but specifically how it can kind of inform your entrepreneurial journey. And to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey that I've had. I'm kind of a serial entrepreneur. I started my first business when I was in high school at age 14. Didn't really know what I was doing. Still don't really know what I'm doing, but I've learned a lot in the intervening 25, to 30 years. So, this journey that I kind of went on was I started this company when I was in high school. When I went to college, I continued to run the company while I was at college. We were selling computer hardware and software. And then while I was in college, the internet happened. This was about 1994, and that was like when, people started getting actual internet connections and the web started to become popular and Netscape and those kinds of things. So I started selling stuff online, building my own e-commerce software to do that, and then ultimately getting into the internet business and starting an internet service provider and hosting company. Shortly after that, in order to support the internet service provider business and hosting company, I started a telephone company, which became possible in the United States after the passage of the Telecom Act of 1996. And then ultimately built and sold those companies, sold my stake in those companies in 2004. I sold my company to the parent company of the Weather Channel, if you've ever heard of that. Since then have been kind of on a continued entrepreneurial journey of using data, using ideas to try to discover kind of what I want to work on next and what's truly interesting out there. Earlier when you heard from Kalani, she mentioned the importance of why, and she referenced Simon Sinek's TED Talk about why is really important. And as you're coming up with ideas for your startups, it's absolutely crucial that you sort of focus in on ideas that matter, not just to the world at large, but to you in particular. And what I want to try to offer today is some insights into how you might use tools like data visualization, although that's not the only tool that you can use, to start to discover ideas that maybe other people aren't seeing yet, so you can kind of live in the future a little bit. That's something that these tools can help you do. And living in the future is really important if you want to come up with ideas that have potential and that haven't yet been really explored yet. And also offer some ideas to maybe see problems a little bit differently and to get at some deeper whys. So let's see if I can make the thing work here. Does it have like an on-off? There we go. So, there we go. This doesn't say Cairo, it's really Baku for sure. Week-long tour. So what I want to first do is talk a little bit about infographics and what the difference between infographics and data visualization is. And you've probably come across things like this on the web where people take, sort of interesting things and then sort of arrange them and they build out something that gets passed around. And this is a pretty reasonable, social object that can be shared. But one thing it's not is a data visualization. This is a bunch of logos arranged in an illustration that does convey, some ideas around sort of what all these social tools are for and how they organize themselves. And nice enough, But one of the things that you want to be thinking about as you kind of look at these different examples is that there is a big difference between data visualization and infographics. This is another infographic. And if you notice, one of the things, oops, how did I do that? Here, go back to I was hoping to get the laser pointer, but I pressed the wrong button. Can somebody press play? Yeah, there's like a button that goes full window here. It's crazy. So, but what I wanted to point out here was that you notice that there's all these numbers and little blobs and things around the edge, and are they representative of anything? Do the sizes represent quantities? What is that about? So again, a nice infographic, but hardly a data visualization, and not really the kind of thing I'm encouraging you to get involved in, unless you want to make marketing pieces like that. So the other thing about data visualization is that it should actually convey information. Now, what is information? Now, if you know anything about information theory and Claude Shannon and all that, it is new, it's something that you didn't already know. It's, the difference between what you know right now and something new that's coming at you that informs you in some important way. So this is a visualization that annoys me a little bit, which is this is allegedly all the internet connected devices on Earth, Well, there's a small problem with that, which is that you really can't get that information in any kind of reliable way. There are some ways that you can get it kind of by proxy, by sort of mapping IP addresses to add, like physical addresses, but because of like VPNs and all sorts of other network topology reasons, this just isn't a really, reliable representation, and it's a little disingenuous to put this out there and say that, something like this is real. The other problem with something like this is that it doesn't differ dramatically from this. And this is the image from NASA of the Earth at night via satellite. And you can see all the lights and stuff. And you can mostly get a sense that, where there are lights in general, there is also internet. So congratulations, people, we have just discovered that the internet coincides with population. What has this told me that we don't already know? Now, granted, there may be some other special sauce there, but it's just not that compelling. And while this does make a nice thing that gets shared virally on the internet, you're not really learning anything particularly new. And you can kind of also see this is population density. It's really just all kind of the same thing. So again, what are we learning new? So I want to propose that if you are going to kind of work on data visualization stuff, it should offer some new ways of seeing. It's kind of like having X-ray vision into another dimension and seeing something in a totally new way. This is my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland in the United States. And this is all of the Twitter users in Baltimore. Now this is a map, but it's not a geographic map. It's a map of communities within the city. And by communities, I mean networks of people who know each other and who pay attention to each other, not necessarily people that are in like a shared common geography. The people on this end of the map have almost no relationships with the people on this end of the map. I'm in about that second E there, because I'm a geek. And if you dig around this little area here, these are all my friends in the tech community and the startup people and all that, along with TEDx, things like that. So just to be really clear on what's represented here, each one of these dots is a Twitter user. Each line, each of these sort of wispy lines is a follow relationship. And the colors indicate shared groups of friends. So for instance, the people that are here in pink have more friends in common than they do with any other color group. So what this allows you to do is to explore a concept called homophily. Homophily is the human tendency of people to group together with people who are like them. And if you notice here, how many of you are sitting next to like a close friend or somebody that you hang out with a lot? Yeah, you guys back here. This happens. This is something we just do, and it's a very common kind of thing. And in the context of cities, we tend to sort of form groups of people who are like us. And the thing that happens a lot in various situations where you have people that are like really of very different groups is that they will group tightly in groups that are so much like them that it creates like racial tension. So this is kind of what happens here. Most of the folks on this end of the spectrum are African American folks. Most of the folks down here are Caucasian folks. Not like you Caucasian, but like generic Caucasian. So at any rate, this turns out to be a really interesting lens through which you can explore how cities work. And I'll come back to it in a few minutes. We'll talk a little bit more about some other cities. But the point is that by using data, we're able to see something in an entirely new way. And because of this, I did a talk that was on TED.com, and it's gotten a lot of play, and a lot of people are interested in the technique. But it took kind of digging around in data visualization and starting to understand the techniques that were available, starting to think about the kind of data that was available to come up with an approach that yielded something like this. So there's a bunch of things that you can do in the startup world that can help you understand kind of the universe that you inhabit. One of the things is to use data analysis to try to understand investors. So for instance, this is a visualization that I made of data from AngelList. And this is all the investors that are identified on AngelList as being in the Eastern Europe and Middle East region. So you can see here that Alexander Dreesen is sort of in the middle, and then there's a whole bunch of other little lobes that orbit around these, and these correspond with, like, this is the Israel lobe here, and I think one of these is Turkey. But as you're like trying to raise money and like interact with people like this, it really pays to know sort of who's influencing whom. The size of the dots here is basically the number of inbound followers that they have. So it gives you a real sense of the landscape. This is Asia, and you can see here that like the people group into like an India group, Singapore, Japan, China, Turkey, Russia, in Israel again. Not that Israel's exactly in Asia, but there's a lot of people in Israel that invest in Asia. You can also understand things like markets. So I have a product in the email space called Maelstrom, and one of the things that we were doing as we were exploring raising money for that startup is trying to figure out where we fit in the context of the email market in general. So again, using data from AngelList, we visualized the entire market, and if you notice, our product Maelstrom is right about here, which is pretty central. Not totally central, but not a bad position to be in. It means that we're connected with a bunch of people in the space. And then you can see various, investors, people like Cyan Bannister and Dave McClure are on here. So, you get a sense of if you were going to try to raise money in that space, you would want to kind of dig around and understand who else is investing money in that space already. This is a visualization that I did combining the education and finance markets for a friend of mine who has a business in that space. She was trying to understand how to target investors and figure out, kind of who she should be talking to. And this gave her an idea of kind of who the people were that were sort of in her field, as well as specific investors that she could pursue. This, of course, is a visualization, but you could also build tools to query this stuff and actually sort of come up with a numeric answer for like, what 6 investors should I talk to based on things like PageRank and network centrality and other network, sort of statistical analysis. This is the entire group of investors in the United States on AngelList. And if, we could dig in further to this, but suffice it to say that people group pretty regionally. New York people are close together. People in Boston, people in Silicon Valley tend to cluster, but there's a lot of people sort of in between. Like Brad Feld is here with Techstars. I think that's Dave McClure with 500 Startups, Paul Singh. So there's a bunch of people that kind of participate in all the different investor markets on AngelList. So the other thing you can do with this is try to understand where you might find employees. Using data from LinkedIn, what I did was create a visualization for Baltimore that shows all the employers in Baltimore based on employees that they had ever shared. So if you think about it, like a company like Johns Hopkins University is related to Towson University by employees that they had ever shared. So this gives you an idea, like there's a bunch of banks down here. If you worked at T. Rowe Price, your next move might very well be Legg Mason, and you can get a real sense of how the economy functions in a city. The other thing that you can use this kind of visualization for is to understand user behaviors. We were trying to come up with some product feature ideas for our Maelstrom product, and one of the things that we wanted to do is to try to understand how email marketers co-occurred. So maybe we could offer some interesting market insights for companies that send email. And one of the things that we found was that, Amazon co-occurs with Apple, co-occurs with Groupon, Living Social, and you could get a real sense of like kind of which companies were reaching common target markets. The other thing that you can do is use visualization techniques to develop entirely new like product concepts. This is something that we're working on that'll be out in a couple of months. It'll look a little bit different from this. But what we're doing is visualizing the inbox on a phone. So rather than giving you a list of messages, we're creating what's called a tree map that shows the largest chunk of messages sort of starting in the upper left and then working its way down, and you can manipulate these things directly. This is an entirely new way of looking at email, and it's going to, quote unquote, change the world, at least as much as we can make it do so. And, it came from approaching it from first principles. If you think about an entrepreneur like Elon Musk, what are the kinds of questions that he asks? He asks, like, why is it so freaking hard to make a rocket? In this day and age, yes, it's a very hard problem, but it ought to be solvable. Why is it so hard to make an electric car? Why is it so hard to have batteries that work? Why can't we have a super fast train that goes from San Francisco to Los Angeles that runs inside of a tunnel? Well, you have to approach these things from first principles. You have to ask yourself, how am I going to get rid of the air at the front of this thing? So you have to put a fan in the front, and then you have to figure out how to get the air to go underneath and use, Bernoulli's principle to generate lift and all this stuff. But again, it's approaching the problem from first principles. So what I would just encourage you is, to use data and use data and analytical techniques that are becoming available now to approach problems in a new way from first principles, and that will yield fruits in terms of creating new insights and new ideas to base products and technical approaches on. So the big thing that we're kind of building towards here is that you can actually start to understand your community and even the world in a pretty important way with these things. And you saw a little glimpse at the beginning with the work that I did on Baltimore. But I've done a lot of work with this with other cities as well. And what I want to drive home here is that the insights and data that we're yielding now about society through these kinds of approaches are unprecedented in human history. We have never understood how societies function in the level of detail that we now have available. So this is San Francisco. This is data, again, data from Twitter. And one of the things that you can see here is that the tech community, as exemplified by this group of geeks and Twitter employees here, is sort of taking over the city in some ways. And if you actually are on the ground in San Francisco, there's a fair amount of tension between what you might call the sort of, old school folks in the city involved in all of these communities and this new emerging group of tech people. This is a pretty, first world problem kind of analysis, but let's look at some other cities. This is Istanbul, a city that you guys might have a little bit more direct familiarity with. One of the things that's interesting here is that by far the largest cohort of users in Istanbul is this group right here. And it's labeled, I'll read it for you just in case you can't read that. Young men, mostly frustrated young men who really, really want girls to like them, and they write poetry to prove it. Now, this analysis came from a friend of mine who lives in Istanbul. And what I had her do was try to understand why all these groups of people were clustered together. What was the common thread? And she analyzed a bunch of data that had come out of that and really tried to relate that to what her experience on the ground in Istanbul is. And this is a group of young men that's probably about 17 to 21 years old who are finding that their prospects are maybe not as bright as they would like, and they're trying to figure out kind of what's next and what to do. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at this end of the spectrum over here, these folks are sort of the geeks. This is sort of the liberal Democrat, sort of enlightened, TEDx startup, kind of crowd. Probably the kind of group that you more or less fit in. And the real question is, what's going to happen to these guys? Are they going to end up over here? Or are they going to end up over here? This is mostly conservative religious and political tweets that are being pushed by sort of the ruling party in Turkey. And, not that there's anything wrong with having, two parties and normal politics as usual, that sort of thing. But with, the situation in the Middle East being so critical as it is in terms of, people becoming radicalized and things like that, this is a really open question. The other thing that's interesting is this right here. And I always call this the island of gay porn. And it sounds funny, and it's kind of funny, but one thing that happens is that in cultures where the internet is sort of deeply censored, this kind of activity turns up on Twitter, and it turns up on other social networks, rather than being just kind of out on the open web. And, whatever, I'm not here to judge what anybody's proclivities are, but you could probably use this as a measure of how healthy a society is to see whether this kind of stuff has been pushed so far down that it turns up only on social networks within a given geography. The other interesting thing up here is that there's an army of troll bots in Istanbul that seems to probably be involved with repeating various kinds of messages that people want to have repeated. These are not organically sort of generated accounts, and they're, probably some kind of trolls. We need to dig further into this to understand this better. But again, this is kind of a really interesting city, and it's a different kind of configuration than what you saw in Baltimore or San Francisco. This is Saudi Arabia. Again, a kind of interesting spectrum of liberal thinking and artists and females down here, and then religious quotes and kind of the government establishment up here. You have this other sort of interesting phenomenon that you guys might have here as well, in terms of sort of people quoting things from the Quran, and then also trying to sell their own sort of service of like Quran quotes and poetry that surrounds that. which is, I think, something interesting in Islamic countries. You also see two distinct groups around the two different football teams. They don't really talk, not too surprising. And again, the little island of gay porn down here. And teenage girls also over here who are, probably not supposed to be talking at all, but they are. You probably heard about the whole situation in Ferguson, Missouri that happened a few months ago, and the situation with Black Lives Matter and that whole hashtag and how that blew up. What's interesting here is in St. Louis, where Ferguson is Ferguson's a little tiny town inside of the St. Louis metropolitan area. And here what you basically have is, again, this kind of really distinct racial divide. So pretty much all of the folks on the bottom end of this line right here are African American, and all the folks on the top side of this are, white. And they don't really intersect at all. And these kinds of situations are what lead to this kind of racial tension. So some people have asked, could you do things like prevent another Ferguson or stop stuff like this from happening or whatever? And I don't think you can. But what I do think you could do is predict places that are the most kind of at risk for this kind of violence to break out, and perhaps offer some advice on how to prepare for it, or to otherwise, tamp it down, or to make it not so bad when incidents inevitably occur. This is Barcelona. Barcelona is kind of a pretty little beach ball. It's just it's got a nice sort of diversity of different things going on here. Various kinds of writing and culture and arts, and the Catalonian independence movement has got a nice little foothold here, as well as FC Barcelona. The thing that I would say about Barcelona is that there doesn't seem to be a group that's very vocal that is oppressed or separate from kind of the main group. I think that having looked at this data in some detail and presented this in Barcelona, I think that there's opportunities for folks on opposite ends of this divide, like the Catalonian independence folks, to talk to the entrepreneurs, and maybe they could come up with some ideas. Because right now they're not really connected that much. But in general, this is a pretty healthy configuration, I think you could argue. Then we get to things like this. Tahrir Square and Gezi Park and Ukraine and Hong Kong, and honestly, Occupy Wall Street and all the other kind of social media driven protests fall into this category. And I think that there's a really legitimate question here, which is, why did these movements sort of build up and then kind of fizzle out? Well, there's a lot of reasons that you could potentially point to, but I think that there's a key reason, which is that a lot of people tried to use social media as a kind of a black box to generate a lot of support and get people engaged, assuming that it was sort of infinite in scope. The fact of the matter is when you study these social maps, you start to realize that messages can only travel so far. They can really tend to only travel to the people in your immediate network. And after they reach out a couple of degrees beyond that, they tend to burn out. Social media doesn't have anywhere near the kind of reach that I think people think it does in terms of generating support for these kinds of messages. And I think that to the extent that governments and other powerful entities, militaries for instance, have access to the information about how social media and how our society is structured, and people do not, that represents a severe power differential that can create instability in society in the long term. And in a lot of ways, if you think about it, having access to this kind of data is as important as having free press and journalism used to be. So this is Cairo. I did this a couple days ago. I don't yet know what I'm looking at here, and I just kind of included this to show you that the process is basically data-driven. So what ends up happening is that this map gets generated and the communities get detected, and then only after that pattern has emerged do we start to then understand kind of who these people are. And so what I'm going to be doing over the course of the next few, probably a couple of months, is interacting with people in Cairo to understand exactly who these communities are, start to come up with kind of a profile for how the city's structured, and get a feel for how people could use this data on the ground there to drive hopefully positive agendas forward. So the other point I want to make in terms of startups, coming back around from this kind of civic angle, is that you should use all the tools that are out there. There are a lot of tools that are available for startups, and I've listed some here that are really good for gathering metrics, and I highly recommend that you check them out in terms of gathering things like user engagement data, web, feature use, and traffic conversion into paid sales, all those sorts of things. So Mixpanel, Crashlytics, Kissmetrics, Google Analytics, Optimizely, Crazy Egg, they all have some really interesting elements. But many of them tend to generate tools like this. This happens to be Crashlytics, but it's almost indistinguishable from most of the other tools that I listed there. And what you have is lines, line graphs and bar graphs, and oftentimes pie charts and stuff like that. And what I want you to think about is that a lot of the tools that we presently use to gather and report data are based on kind of a 18th century or 17th century way of thinking about data, and that is to write down each thing that happened into a logbook and then generate like a two-dimensional graph of that. That is super, super outdated, and you shouldn't be constrained in your thinking about data, as being only represented in that way. All we've really done for most of the last, 40 some years that we've been able to use computers to track this kind of data is to, computerize that very old school, ancient kind of technique. But there's so much more that's available now in terms of data collection and reporting and generating interesting insights. And again, like the stuff that I was generating from cities, that's graph data. That's basically analyzing what you call sparse matrices. And that's a different way of analyzing problems. And actually, a lot of people in the information security world are starting to use that kind of visualization tools to understand threats much better than they ever could from log-based and sort of normal graph-based analysis. So again, study graph representations, study data science, and you can come up with some really novel ways of thinking about the world. So again, we talked about this, using first principles to think about data and the problems that you'd like to solve and coming up with new approaches. It's a super powerful way of generating new insights. Now, if you want to get involved with doing graph analysis, these are some tools that might be useful to you. Most of the stuff that I created in terms of the actual visual piece was done with this package here called Gephi, and it's available at gephi.org. There's other packages that do some similar stuff in JavaScript for the web, D3, Sigma.js, BioFabric. BioFabric's a little different, but again, a very interesting way of thinking about problems that can offer you some new insights into how you might go about analyzing some interesting new phenomena and products. So this is me. If you'd like to contact me and discuss this further, I'd be happy to talk to you. I had hoped to present some new data on Azerbaijan today, and I'm actually collecting it. But it takes quite a while to generate that data, and also, I'll be honest, Azerbaijan does not generate anywhere near as much social media data as some place like Barcelona or Cairo does. And I could go into some reasons why, but I think what we'll do now is end and see if there's any questions. And thank you very much.
Thank you. So are there any questions for Dave? I see a hand here. Maybe let me grab the other mic. Let's see how this works. Can I try? Does it work?
Hey, yeah, thank you very much. Just two quick questions. One, does it work with Facebook as well? And two, do you have a case study involving revenue growth or profitability growth by using these tools?
So the first question about Facebook, you can use this kind of data with any kind of, or this kind of analysis with any kind of data where you generate a sparse matrix where you've got, sort of entities and then relationships between them. So I've used it with Facebook data. The trick is getting the data out of Facebook at scale is tricky. You can do it pretty reasonably for Facebook groups, it turns out, and that's an interesting way to kind of get started. The other thing that you guys can do that I would highly recommend is to, there's a tool called NetViz. It's spelled NetVizz. And if you just Google that, like Google NetViz tutorial, and you'll find this. It allows you to visualize your own personal Facebook network. And that just gives you an interesting insight into kind of like who you are and who you hang with and where your friends came from and that sort of thing. So I highly recommend checking that out. As far as revenue growth and whatever, I mean, So far, I haven't turned any of this into a product yet. We're in the process of starting to think about doing that. And the trick is that because some of this stuff is really hard to do, it's difficult to scale yet. So we're figuring that out. And I would say within the next year or two, we'll probably have some sort of product available that offers some of this stuff out there. But again, that's why I did this stuff, is to come up with like interesting new product ideas, and also to provide hopefully some really important insights into society, and make the world suck a little bit less. So
I had one more question here.
Thank you once again. I just wanted to highlight on the point that you said that making that information available for the people somewhere like Ferguson would help, let's just say, understand that there's a current tension even though it's not visible on the street. First question is, how would a place where there's no tension look like? Because from all of the data we've seen, I can't understand what a normal place would look like.
Yeah, Barcelona was probably the closest to some place that I would say is like, not undergoing what I would call like massive strife. Now again, the Catalonian independence movement is definitely something that's interesting, but within Barcelona itself, there's so much agreement on that issue that you don't see it as a divide. If I were to map Madrid against Barcelona, you would see them totally on opposite ends. So anyway, that sort of round configuration, I would say, is normal and good. When you end up with like these really eccentric configurations,
no islands, basically.
no islands, and not kind of like trapezoidal or egg-shaped. Like it should be, everybody's sort of in a normal kind of configuration surrounding, shared interests like media and television, stuff like that.
All right. Thank you. That's enough.
So were there any other questions? Do you guys currently use data visualization? Anyone? Can I see hands actually? Is anyone using it already? That's few. After this talk, how many people are planning to use this? Look at this.
There you go. Definitely check out that NetViz thing. It's pretty easy for beginners, and Gephi runs, it's just a package that you can run in Java, works on Windows and Linux and Mac and whatever, so check it out. It's really cool stuff.
Thank you so much, Dave. Please, one more round of applause.